May it please the tribunal, two important conferences which have already been adverted to by the prosecution show clearly how the defendant Goering inspired and directed the preparation of the German economy for aggressive war. On the 8th of July, 1938, he addressed a number of the leading German aircraft manufacturers and laid the groundwork for a vast increase in aircraft production. He stated that war with Czechoslovakia was imminent and boasted that the German Air Force was already superior in quality and quantity to the English. He said that if Germany wins the war, she will be the greatest power in the world, dominating the world market, and Germany will be a rich nation. For this goal, risks must be taken. That quotation, if it may please the court, is taken from R-140, USA Exhibit 160. A few weeks after the Munich Agreement, on 14th October 1938, at another conference held in Goering's office, he made the statement that Hitler had instructed him to organize a gigantic armament program which would make insignificant all previous achievements. He indicated that he had been ordered to build as rapidly as possible an air force 5 times as large, to increase the speed of Army and Navy rearmament, and to concentrate on offensive weapons, principally heavy artillery and heavy tanks. And at that meeting, he proposed a specific program designed to accomplish those ends. That is a short summary of facts which appear from USA Exhibit 123, already in evidence, our document 1301 PS. In his dual role as Reich Air Minister and Commander-in-Chief of the German Air Force, it was Goering's function to develop the Luftwaffe to practical war strength. As early as the 10th of March, 1935, in an interview with a correspondent of the London Daily Mail, the mask of hypocrisy was removed, and Goering frankly announced to the world that he was in the process of building a true military air force. 2 months later, in a speech to 1,000 Air Force officers, Goering spoke in a still bolder vein. I offer in evidence from United States Exhibit 437, our document 3441 PS, which is Goering's Reden und Aufsätze, as our 3441 PS. Another excerpt that has not yet been read in evidence, from page 242. Goering said, I repeat, I intend to create a Luftwaffe which, if the hour should strike, shall burst upon the foe like a chorus of revenge. The enemy must have the feeling of being lost already before even having fought. In the same year, on the 16th of March, 1935, he signed his name to the conscription law, which provided for compulsory military service and constituted an act of defiance on the part of Nazi Germany in violation of the Versailles Treaty. The tribunal will take judicial notice of that decree, which is our document 1654 PS, from which I shall not read with the permission of the tribunal, the law for the organization of the armed forces. It is cited in 1935 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 369. As is demonstrated by the affidavit of Ambassador Messerschmitt, already in evidence, Goering's statements during this period left no doubt in the minds of Allied diplomats that Germany was engaged in full mobilization of air power for an impending war. Goering was, in fact, the central figure in German preparation for military aggression. In German economic development, too, he held the key positions throughout the pre-war period. And although he held no official position in the field of foreign affairs, as the number 2 Nazi, history records that he was prominent in all major phases of Nazi aggression between 1937 and 1941. In the Austrian affair, Goering was the prompter and director of the diplomatic tragicomedy enacted before a shocked but silent world. The tribunal is familiar with Goering's complicity in the aggression against Austria. However, some additional documents have just come to our notice that show that Goering not alone participated actively, but may even have been in direct charge of the German plan to bring about the Austrian Anschluss. I will offer the first of these documents, our document 3473 PS, as USA Exhibit 581. Wait a minute, I'm not reading it. I shall not read from that exhibit, if your honors please, but I'd like to call the attention of the tribunal to the letter from Kepler, who was one of Goering's agents, addressed to the defendant Goering. It is dated the 6th of January, 1938. From its context, it would seem that a valid inference can be drawn that Goering was already active in the Austrian matter in 1937. Our prior evidence brought him into the picture much later. The prosecution believes this document to be of great significance, as it shows that the defendant Seyss-Inquart actually had Goering's mandate to carry out the orders of the Nazi conspirators in Vienna. The document itself will be read and discussed in the presentation of the case, showing the individual responsibility of the defendant Seyss-Inquart, and I shall not take the time of the tribunal at this time. The second document I wish to introduce as USA Exhibit 582, our document 3472 PS. This exhibit would seem to show that the conspirators attempted to create the impression that the Anschluss, when it took place, was achieved by legal means. The command apparently was given to members of the NSDAP in Austria to keep hands off in order to permit the deviltry to be worked out by the official Reich agencies, that is, through the defendant Goering and presumably the defendant von Papen, by direct contract with the Austrian officials. And I read from that document. Yesterday, information reached me to the effect that Landesleiter Leopold, and may I advert for a moment to point out that the word Landesleiter is the title to the leader of the Nazi community in Austria, that the Landesleiter Leopold also on his part has started negotiations with Chancellor Schuschnigg. Thereupon, I have asked the Foreign Office to investigate the truth of this information. and in case it was true, to take care that such negotiations not be held because they would merely disturb the proceeding of the other negotiations. Just now I got word from the Foreign Office that they received a report from the embassy in Vienna confirming the facts. I therefore would like to know whether it would not be more appropriate to forbid Landesleiter Leopold and the other members of the country's leadership to negotiate with Chancellor Schuschnigg, as well as with any Austrian government authorities, as to the execution of the Pact of 11 July 1936, if it is not done after contacting and in agreement with the authorities in charge in the Reich. Now below, if I may call the attention of the tribunal to the note that appears below this letter. It is written in blue pencil, and while the translator has not indicated the initial below that note, it is a large G, and I have no doubt that that note was written by the defendant Goering. It reads, agreed. Minister Hess or Mr. Bormann can give this order best. Kepler ought to ask, therefore, by telephone. If I may direct your attention to the upper right corner, there is another note in pencil. Transmitted to Mr. Kepler on 11 February 38 by Miss Sest. And it's signed with an initial G, which in this case, however, we are quite sure is the initial of Miss Grundmann, who is one of Goering's secretaries. The third document I offer as Exhibit 583 is our document 3471 PS. The first letter of this exhibit is written by the same Kepler to the same Bodenschatz mentioned a short while ago, but who is now a general. I shall not read from this exhibit with the permission of the tribunal, but I shall briefly summarize it. This letter and the annexes show that Leopold, the Nazi Landesleiter in Austria, was apparently not completely amenable to the orders given by Berlin and pursued his own methods for accomplishing an Anschluss. The second annex to this letter, addressed to Kepler, who appears from this letter to have been an SS Obergruppenführer, shows that prominent Nazis had declared themselves in favor of a Major Klausner to succeed Leopold as Landesleiter. And I would like to call the tribunal's attention to the fact that in the left margin of the covering letter appear some red crayon marks in the characteristic color employed on several occasions, to our knowledge, by Goering. And they would seem to show that Goering personally had seen these documents and that General Bodenschatz had brought them to his attention. In any event, these letters again demonstrate that Goering was one of the principal conspirators in the Austrian affair. When the time finally came on the 11th of March, 1938, to consummate the Anschluss, Goering was in complete command. Throughout the afternoon and evening of that day, he directed by telephone the activities of the defendant Seyss-Inquart and the other Nazi conspirators in Vienna. The pertinent portions of these telephone conversations it will be remembered, were read into the record. It will be recalled that early on the same evening of 11 March, he dictated to the defendant, Seyss Inquart, the telegram which the latter was to send to Berlin, requesting the Nazi government to send German troops to prevent bloodshed. 2 days later, he was able to call the defendant Ribbentrop in London and gleefully relate to him of his success, and that the story that we had given an ultimatum is just foolish gossip. Similarly, Goering read, and if I may advert for a moment, that passage that I have just alluded to was read into the record at page 581. Similarly, Goering played an important role in the attack on Czechoslovakia. In March of 1938, at the time of the Anschluss, he had given a solemn assurance to the Czechoslovakian minister in Berlin that the developments in Austria would in no way have a detrimental influence on the relations between Germany and Czechoslovakia. And he had emphasized the continued earnest endeavor on the part of Germany to improve these relations. In this connection, Goering had used the expression, "Ich gebe Ihnen mein Ehrenwort," I give you my word of honor. That expression was read previously into the record at page 962. On the other hand, in his address to German airplane manufacturers on the 8th of July 1938, which I have already mentioned, he made his private views on this subject, which were hardly consistent with his solemn official statements, abundantly clear. And on the 14th of October, shortly after the Munich Agreement, at a conference in the Air Ministry, Goering stated that the Sudetenland had to be exploited with all means, and that he counted upon the complete industrial assimilation of Czechoslovakia. Meanwhile, as proof before the tribunal shows, he was deceiving the representatives of the puppet Slovakian government to the same end. In the following year, with the rape of Czechoslovakia complete, Goering frankly stated what Germany's purpose had been throughout the whole affair. He explained that the incorporation of Bohemia and Moravia into the German economy had taken place, among other reasons, in order to increase the German war potential by exploitation of the industry there. Goering was also a moving force in the later crimes against the peace. As the successor designate to Hitler, chief of the air forces, and economic czar of Greater Germany, he was a party to all the planning for military operations of the Nazi forces in the East and in the West. In the Polish affair, for example, it was Goering who, on the 31st of January 1935, gave assurances to the Polish government through Count Czembek, as revealed in the Polish White Book, of which I asked the tribunal to take judicial notice, that there should not be the slightest fear in Poland that on the German side, it, meaning the German-Polish alliance, would not be continued in the future. Yet 4 years later, Goering helped to formulate plans for the ruthless invasion of Polish territory. In respect of the attack upon the Soviet Union, the documents already introduced prove that plans for the ruthless exploitation of Soviet territory were made months in advance of the opening of hostilities, Goering was placed in charge of this army of spoliation, whose mission was that of seizing raw materials and taking over all important concerns. But these specific instances cited are merely illustrative of Goering's activities in the field of aggressive war. On pages 20, 21, and 22 of our brief, there appear a list of documents, by no means exhaustive, previously offered by the prosecution, which demonstrate Goering's knowledge of and continued participation in the Nazi war program. We turn now to Goering's responsibility for planning and his participation in the procurement of forced labor, the deportation and enslavement of residents of occupied territories, the employment of prisoners of war in war industry, the looting of works of art, and the Germanization and spoliation of countries overrun by the Nazis. Evidence previously introduced has detailed the slave labor program of the Nazi conspirators and has shown its two purposes, both of them criminal. The first was to satisfy the labor requirements of the Nazi war machine by forcing residents of occupied countries to work in Germany. The second purpose was to destroy or weaken the peoples of the occupied territories. It has been shown that millions of foreign workers were taken to Germany, for the most part under pressure and generally by physical force, that these workers were forced to labor under conditions of indescribable brutality and degradation, and that often they were used in factories and industries devoted exclusively to the production of munitions of war. Goering was at all times implicated in the slave labor program. Recruitment and allocation of manpower and determination of working conditions were included in his jurisdiction as plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan. And from its beginning, a part of the 4-year plan office was devoted to such work. I asked the tribunal to take judicial notice of our document 1862 PS in this connection. And with the permission of the tribunal, I shall not read from the same. The ordinance for the execution of the 4-year plan, dated the 18th of October 1936, which appears in the 1936 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 887. Soon after the fall of Poland, Goering began the enslavement of large numbers of Poles. On the 25th of January 1940, the defendant Frank, the Governor General of Poland, reported to Goering on his directive for the, and I quote, supply and transportation of at least 1 million male and female agricultural and industrial workers to the Reich, among them at least 750,000 agricultural workers, of which at least 50% must be women, in order to guarantee agricultural production in the Reich and as a replacement for industrial workers lacking in the Reich. I end the quote, which is taken from our USA Exhibit 172, our document 1375 PS. That orders for this enormous number of workers originated with the defendant Goering is clear from statements in the defendant Frank's diary for the 10th of May 1940, already introduced in evidence. For the harsh treatment given those workers when they reached Germany, the defendant Goering is also responsible. On the 8th of March 1940, as plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan and as chairman of the Cabinet Council for the Defense of the Reich, he issued a directive entitled Treatment of Male and Female Civilian Workers of Polish Nationality in the Reich. I refer to our document R148 as proof of that fact. I shall not introduce it at this time into evidence with the permission of the tribunal, as it will be introduced by the Soviet prosecution at a later date. On the 29th of January 1942, the Division for the Employment of Labor in the 4-year Plan Office issued a circular signed by Dr. Mansfeld, the General Delegate for Labor employed in the 4-year Plan Office, addressed to various civilian and military authorities in the occupied territories, explaining that, and I quote, any and all methods must be adopted, end quote, to force workers to go to Germany. I shall not read from our exhibit, if the tribunal please, but I would like to offer in evidence 1183 PS as our exhibit 585. This is a circular letter dated the 29th of January 1942 of the Commissioner for the 4-year Plan. It has been shown previously that on the 21st of March 1942, Hitler promulgated a decree appointing the defendant Sauckel Plenipotentiary General for Manpower, directing him to carry out his tasks within the framework of the 4-year plan, and making him directly responsible to Goering as head of the 4-year plan. On the 27th of March 42, the defendant Goering issued his important enabling decree in pursuance of the decree of the Führer of the 21st of March. The tribunal has already judicially noted this decree, which is our document 1666 PS. Since the defendant Sauckel was an authority under the 4-year plan, the defendant Goering retains full responsibility for the enormous war crimes committed by Sauckel as Plenipotentiary General for Manpower. These crimes have been the subject of our presentations on slave labor and on the illegal use of prisoners of war. It was also proven on those presentations that the Nazi conspirators ordered prisoners of war to work under dangerous conditions and in the manufacturing and transportation of arms and munitions of war in violation of the laws of war and of Articles 31 and 32 of the Geneva Convention of the 27th of July, 1929 on prisoners of war. The defendant Goering had a part in all these crimes. At a conference on the 7th of November, 1941, the subject of which was the employment of citizens of the Soviet Union, including prisoners of war, it appears from a memorandum signed by Körner, who was State Secretary to the defendant Goering as plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan, that Goering gave certain ruthless directives for the use of Soviet citizens, both prisoners of war and free Soviet workers, as laborers. I refer to our document 1193 PS, which with the permission of the tribunal I shall not offer into evidence at this time, and which will be offered by the Soviet prosecution. in a set of top-secret notes of outlines laid down by Goering in what was apparently the same conference of the 7th of November, 1941, which are already in evidence, the facts appear that of a total of 5 million prisoners of war, 2 million were employed in war industries, that it was better to employ prisoners of war than unsuitable foreign workers, that Poles, Dutchmen, and so forth should be seized if necessary as prisoners of war and employed as such if work through free contract cannot be obtained. These facts, if your honors please, appear in our document 1206 PS, which was admitted in evidence as USA Exhibit 215. In a secret letter from the Reichsminister of Labor to the presidents of the regional labor exchange offices, already in evidence, it is furthermore recorded that upon the personal order of the Reichsmarschall, the defendant Goering, 100,000 men are to be taken from among the French prisoners of war not yet employed in the armament industry and assigned to the airplane armament industry, and that gaps in manpower supply resulting therefrom are to be filled by Soviet prisoners of war. Evidence has also been introduced showing the organized, systematic program of the Nazi conspirators for the cultural impoverishment of every country in Europe. The continuous connection of the defendant Goering with these activities has been substantiated. In October 1939, the defendant Goering requested Dr. Mühlmann to undertake immediately the securing of all Polish art treasures. In his affidavit already offered, Dr. Mühlmann states that he was the special deputy of the Governor General of Poland, the defendant Frank, for the safeguarding of art treasures in the general government from October 1939 to September 1943, and that the defendant Goering, in his capacity as chairman of the Reich Defense Council, had commissioned him with this duty. Mühlmann also confirms that it was the official policy of the defendant Frank to take into custody all important art treasures which belong to Polish public institutions, private collections, and the church, and that such art treasures were actually confiscated. It also appears from a report made by Dr. Mühlmann on the 16th of July 1943 on his operations that at one time 31 valuable sketches by the artist Albrecht were taken from a Polish collection and personally handed to the defendant Goering, who took them to the Führer's headquarters. The part played by Goering...
Mr. Albrecht, would you go just a little bit slower?
The part played by the defendant Goering in the looting of art by the Einsatzstab Rosenberg has been shown. We refer to USA Exhibit 368, which is our document 141 PS, which is an order dated the 5th of November 1940, already read in evidence, in which Goering directs the chief of the military administration in Paris and the Einsatzstab Rosenberg to dispose of the art objects brought to the Louvre in the following priority. First, those art objects as to which the Führer had reserved to himself the decision as to their use. Second, those art objects which serve to complete the Reichsmarshal's collection. Third, those art objects and library stocks, the use of which seems useful to the establishment of higher institutions of learning. And fourthly, those art objects suited for German museums. In view of the high priority afforded by the foregoing order to the completion of the defendant's own collection, it is not surprising to find that Goering continued to aid the operations of the Einsatzstab Rosenberg. It has been established that on the 1st of May 1941, Goering issued an order under his own signature to all party, state, and Wehrmacht services, requesting them to give all possible support and assistance to the Chief of Staff of Reichsleiter Rosenberg. By May 1942, the defendant Goering was able to boast of the assistance which he had rendered to the work of the Einsatzstab Rosenberg. In our document 1015 small I PS, which has been read in evidence on page 1678 of the record, he is shown writing to the defendant Rosenberg that he personally supports the work of the Einsatzstab wherever he can do so, and that he accounted for the seizure of such a large number of art objects because he was able to render assistance to the Einsatzstab. Thus, the defendant Goering's responsibility for the planning for the looting of art, which was actually accomplished by the Einsatzstab Rosenberg, would seem clear. Details both of the execution of the Germanization and spoliation policies in the western and eastern countries occupied by the German armies will be presented subsequently by the French and Soviet delegations. The responsibility of the defendant Goering in his capacity as plenipotentiary for the four-year plan, as president of the Cabinet Council for the Defense of the Reich, and in other capacities will be further demonstrated by that evidence. The plans of the Nazi conspirators with respect to Poland have been shown by evidence already offered. The Nazis purported to incorporate the four western provinces of Poland into the German Reich. In the remaining portions occupied by them, they set up the general government. It has been shown that the Nazis planned to Germanize the so-called incorporated territories ruthlessly by deporting the Polish intelligentsia, Jews, and dissident elements to the government general for eventual elimination, by confiscating Polish property, by sending those so deprived of their property to Germany as laborers, and by importing German settlers. It was specifically planned to exploit the people and material resources of the territory within the government general by taking whatever was needed to strengthen the Nazi war machine, thus impoverishing this region and reducing it to a vassal state. The defendant Goering, together with Hitler and Lammers, and with the defendants Frick and Hess, on the 8th of October 1939, signed the decree by which certain parts of Polish territory were incorporated into the Reich. Purporting to act by virtue of the foregoing decree, Goering, as plenipotentiary for the four-year plan, signed an order on the 30th of October concerning the introduction of the four-year plan in the Eastern Territories. In his directive, dated the 19th of October, 1939, Goering stated that the task for the economic treatment of the various administrative regions would differ depending on whether a country was to be incorporated politically into the German Reich or whether the government general was involved, which in all probability would not be made a part of Germany. He went on to say, in the first mentioned territories, the reconstruction and expansion of the economy, the safeguarding of all their production facilities and supplies must be aimed at, as well as a complete incorporation into the greater German economic system at the earliest possible time. On the other hand, there must be removed from the territories of the government general all raw materials, scrap materials, machines, etc., which are of use for the German war economy. Enterprises which are not absolutely necessary for the meager maintenance of the naked existence of the population must be transferred to Germany, unless such transfer would require an unreasonably long period of time and make it more practical to exploit those enterprises by giving them German orders to be executed at their present location. From the foregoing documents, the complicity of the defendant Goering in the plans for the ruthless exploitation of Poland clearly appears. But his fine hand also may be found behind the remainder of the Nazi plans for Poland. As an illustration, it was the defendant Goering who signed with Hitler and the defendant Keitel the secret decree of the 7th October 1939, which entrusted Himmler with the task of executing the Germanization program. That secret decree was read into evidence at pages 1522 to 23. Evidence already introduced has shown from the mouths of Himmler, the defendant Frank, and others just what this appointment involved in human suffering and degradation. Similarly, it was the defendant Goering who, by virtue of his powers as plenipotentiary for the four-year plan, issued a decree on the 17th September 1940 concerning confiscations in the incorporated Eastern Territories. This decree applied to property of citizens of the former Polish state within the territory of the Greater German Reich, including the incorporated Eastern Territories. I ask the court to take judicial notice of our document 1665 PS, which is an order concerning the treatment of property of nationals of the former Polish state, which is cited in 1940 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 1270. I shall read from this document, Article 1, property of nationals of the former Polish state within the area of the Greater German Reich, including annexed eastern territories, is subject to confiscation, administration by commissioner, and sequestration in accordance with the following regulations. And then I skip to Article 2. Confiscation will be applied in case of property belonging to A, Jews, B, persons who have fled or who have absented themselves for longer than a temporary period. Confiscations may be applied, A, if the property is needed for the public good, especially for purposes of national defense or the strengthening of German folkdom. B, if the owners or other persons entitled to it immigrated into the then area of the German Reich after the 1st of October 1918. And I skip now to Article 9, first part. Sequestered property can be confiscated in favor of the Reich by the competent office if the public weal, particularly the defense of the Reich or the consolidation of the German nationality, requires it. Evidence has also been introduced by the United States showing the extent to which the spoliation of Soviet territory and resources and the barbarous treatment inflicted on Soviet citizens were the result of plans long made and carefully drawn up by the Nazis before they launched their aggressive war on the Soviet Union. The Nazis planned to destroy the industrial potential of the northern regions occupied by their armies, and so to administer the production of food in the south and southeast, which normally produced a surplus of food, that the population of the northern region would inevitably be reduced to starvation because of diversion of such surplus food to the German Reich. It has been shown also that the Nazis planned to incorporate Galicia and all of the Baltic countries into Germany and to convert the Crimea, an area north of the Crimea, the Volga territory, and the district around Baku into German colonies. By April 1941, almost 2 months prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union, it appears that Hitler had entrusted the defendant Goering with the overall direction of the economic administration in the area of operations and in the areas under political administration. It further appears that Goering had set up an economic staff and subsidiary authorities to carry out this function. The form of this organization created by Goering and the duties of its various sections appear more clearly in a set of directives for the operation of the economy in the newly occupied territories issued by Goering as Reichsmarschall of the Greater German Reich in June 1941. These directives are contained in the important green portfolio, which, curiously enough, was printed by the Wehrmacht. By the terms of these directives, it is stated that the orders of the Reichsmarschall cover all economic fields, including nutrition and agriculture. They are to be executed by the subordinate economic officers. An economic staff east was charged with the execution of orders transmitted to it from higher authority. One subdivision of this staff the agricultural section, was charged with the following functions: nutrition and agriculture, the economy of all agricultural products, provision of supplies for the Army in cooperation with the Army groups concerned. Excerpts from this green portfolio have already been admitted as USA Exhibit 315. But I will offer at this time, without reading, some additional excerpts in support of the facts that have just been related. I would like to offer as USA Exhibit 587 our document 1743 PS. Now this is another copy of the green portfolio, and I want this to show to the I want to offer this portfolio to show to the tribunal that these directives were originally published in June 1941. Document EC 472, which is already in evidence as USA Exhibit 315, was a revised edition published in July 1941. In other words, the economic plan for the invasion was ready when the Wehrmacht actually marched into the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. As appears from the foregoing directives, it was a subdivision of the economic organization set up by the defendant Goering, the agricultural section of the Economic Staff East, which rendered a top-secret report on the 23rd of May, 1941, containing a set of policy directives for the exploitation of Soviet territory, of Soviet agriculture. It will be recalled that these directives contemplated abandonment of all industry in the food deficit regions, with certain exceptions, and the diversion of food from the food surplus regions to German needs, even though millions of people would inevitably die of starvation as a result. Those directives have already been read into evidence at page 1558. Minutes of a meeting at Hitler's headquarters on the 16th of July, 1941, kept by the defendant Bormann, have also been read in part in evidence. It was at this meeting that Hitler stated that the Nazis never intended to leave the countries then being occupied by their armies, that although the rest of the world was to be deceived on this point, nevertheless, and I quote, "this need not prevent us taking all necessary measures, shooting, desettling, etc., and we shall take them." End of the quotation. That quotation, if it may please the tribunal, is taken from our exhibit, USA 317, our document L221. And then Hitler discussed making the Crimea and other parts of the Soviet Union into German colonies. The defendant Goering was present and participated in this conference. As a final illustration, it appears from a memorandum dated the 16th of September 1941, which is our Exhibit 318, that Goering presided over a meeting of German military officials concerned with the better exploitation of the occupied territories for the German food economy. In discussing this topic, the defendant Goering said that in the occupied territories, on principle, only those people are to be supplied with an adequate amount of food who work for us. Even if one wanted to feed all the other inhabitants, one could not do it in the newly occupied eastern areas. It is therefore wrong to funnel off food supplies for this purpose if it is done at the expense of the army and necessitates increased supplies from home. In the foregoing documents, participation of the defendant Goering in the Nazi plans for committing wholesale war crimes in occupied territories is, we submit, clear. I turn now to the Goering's planning and his participation in inhumane acts committed against civilian populations before and during the war. It has been shown that shortly after becoming Prime Minister of Prussia in 1933, Goering created the Gestapo in Prussia, which became a model for that instrument of terror as it was extended to the rest of Germany. Concentration camps were established in Prussia in the spring of 1933 under his administration. And these camps were then placed in charge of the Gestapo, of which he was chief. The extent to which Goering and the other Nazi conspirators employed these institutions as agencies for the commission of their crimes already appears from the evidence. In 1936, Himmler became chief of the German police. Thereafter, Goering was able to devote his attention chiefly to the task of creating the German Air Force and to the task of preparing the nation economically for aggressive war. However, he continued to be concerned with these institutions of his creation. An example of this is shown in our document 1584 PSI, already introduced as USA Exhibit 221, which is a teletype sent by Goering to Himmler, in which he requested the latter to place at his disposal as great a number of concentration camp inmates as possible, as the situation of air warfare made the subterranean transfer of industry necessary. In his reply, Himmler advised Goering by teletype that a survey on the employment of prisoners in the aviation industry showed that 36,000 were being employed for the purposes of the air forces, and that an increase to a total of 90,000 prisoners was being contemplated. Evidence has been introduced as to medical experiments performed on human beings at the concentration camp at Dachau, and the part that Field Marshal Milch, State Secretary and Deputy to the defendant Goering as Air Minister, for whose acts the latter must bear full responsibility, is abundantly clear from letters written by Milch to General Wolf on the 20th of May 1942 and to Himmler in August 1942, both of which have been read in evidence at page 1850 of the record, our document 343 PS. And finally, I turn to Goering's participation and planning for the elimination of all members of the Jewish race from the economic life of Germany, and in the planned extermination of all Jews from the continent of Europe. In 1935, the defendant Goering, as president of the Reichstag, made a speech urging that body to pass the infamous Nuremberg race laws. I offer as USA Exhibit 588 our document 3458 PS, which is an excerpt from Rühle, Das Dritte Reich. Page 257. Goering said, God has created the races. He did not want equality, and therefore we energetically reject any attempt to falsify the concept of race purity by making it equivalent with racial equality. We have experienced what it means when a people has to live in accordance with the laws of an equality that are alien to its kind and contrary to its nature, contrary to nature. For this equality does not exist. We have never acknowledged such an idea, and therefore must reject it also as a matter of principle in our laws, and we must acknowledge that purity of race which nature and providence have destined for us. Again, to show his official attitude, as revealed on the 26th of March, 1938, in a speech in Vienna, I offer as USA Exhibit 437 our document 3460 PS. Starting with pages 348, Goering said, I must address myself with a serious word to the city of Vienna. The city of Vienna can no longer rightfully be called a German city. So many Jews live in this city. Where there are 300,000 Jews, you cannot speak of a German city. Vienna must once more become a German city because it must perform important tasks for Germany in Germany's Ostmark. These tasks lie in the sphere of culture as well as in the sphere of economics. For neither of these can we, in the long run, put up with a Jew. This, however, should not only be attempted by inappropriate interference and stupid measures, but must be done systematically and carefully. As delegate for the 4-year plan, I commissioned the Reichsstatthalter in Austria, jointly with the plenipotentiary of the Reich, to consider and take any steps necessary for the redirection of Jewish commerce, that is, for the Aryanization of business and economic life, and to execute this process in accordance with our laws, legally but inexorably. Acting within the framework of economic preparation for aggressive war, the Nazi conspirators then began the complete elimination of Jews from economic life preparatory to their physical annihilation. The defendant Goering, as head of the 4-year plan, was in active charge of this phase of the persecutions. The first step in his campaign was the decree of the 26th of April 1933 requiring registration of all Jewish-owned property. Both Goering and the defendant Frick signed that law. It is already in evidence. I beg the tribunal's pardon. I would like the tribunal to take judicial notice of that decree, which is our document 1406 PS, and cited as 1938 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 414. Now, armed with the information thus secured, the Nazi conspirators were fully prepared to take the next step. The killing of Vom Rath, a German legation secretary in Paris on the 9th of November 1938, was made the pretext for widespread spontaneous riots, which included the looting and burning of many Jewish synagogues, homes, and shops, all carefully organized and supervised by the Nazi conspirators. The defendant Goering was fully informed of measures taken. The teletype orders of the 10th of November 1938, given by Heydrich, are already in evidence and were read at page 1405 of the record. A letter which Heydrich wrote to Goering on the following day has also been read. It is our document 3058 PS, USA Exhibit 508. In it, Himmler summarizes the so-called spontaneous riots that had taken place. He reported the day after the riots that insofar as the official reports from the district police were concerned, he was able to state that 815 shops were destroyed, 171 dwelling houses set on fire or destroyed, and that all this indicates only a fraction of the actual damage caused as far as arson is concerned. He also said that due to the urgency of the reporting, the records received to date were entirely limited to general statements such as, quote, numerous, or, quote, most shops destroyed. Therefore, said Mr. Heydrich, the figures given must have been exceeded considerably. 191 synagogues were set on fire, and another 76 completely destroyed, in addition to 11 parish halls, cemetery chapels, and similar buildings that were set on fire. 20,000 Jews were arrested. 36 deaths were reported. And seriously injured numbered a further 36. Immediately after these so-called spontaneous riots of the 9th of November, Goering acted as chairman of a meeting at the Reich Ministry of Air devoted to the Jewish question, which also was attended by the defendant Funk and other conspirators. The stenographic report on that meeting is an extraordinary document, and it does not make pretty reading. It is our document 1816 PS, which has already been offered as USA Exhibit 261. And I should like to read certain passages that have not as yet been read into the record. I read from the top of the first page, the German original, the first two paragraphs of page 1. Goering speaks. Gentlemen, today's meeting is of a decisive nature. I have received a letter written on the Führer's orders by the Stabsleiter of the Führer's deputy Bormann, requesting that the Jewish question be now, once and for all, coordinated and solved one way or another. And yesterday, once again, did the Führer request by phone for me to take coordinated action in the matter. Since the problem is mainly an economic one, it is from the economic angle that it shall have to be tackled. Naturally, a number of legal measures shall have to be taken which fall into the sphere of the Minister for Justice and into that of the Minister of the Interior. And certain propaganda measures shall be taken care of by the office of the Minister for Propaganda. The Minister for Finance and the Minister for Economic Affairs shall take care of problems falling into their respective ressorts. Specific measures to effect the Aryanization of Jewish businesses were then discussed. A representative of German insurance companies was called in to assist in solving the difficulties created by the fact that most of the Jewish stores and other property destroyed in the rioting were in fact insured, in some cases ultimately by foreign insurance companies. All present were agreed that it would be unfortunate to pass a law which would have the effect of allowing foreign insurance companies to escape liability. The defendant Goering then suggested a characteristic solution. Then I pass to page 10. German, it's the third full paragraph on page 311. Goering said, "No, I don't even dream of refunding the insurance companies the money. The companies are liable. No, the money belongs to the state. That's quite clear. That would indeed be a present for the insurance companies. You make a wonderful petitum there. You'll fulfill your obligations. You may count on that." It is superfluous to quote further from the extensive discussion of all phases of the persecution of the Jews which took place at this meeting. It is sufficient to point out that on the same day, the defendant Goering, over his own signature, promulgated 3 decrees putting into effect the most important matters decided in this meeting. In the first of these decrees, a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmark was placed on all German Jews. I asked the tribunal to take judicial notice of that decree, which is our document 1412 PS, and appears in 1938 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 1579. The second decree entitled A Decree on Elimination of Jews from German Economic Life, bar Jews from trades and crafts. The court will take judicial notice of that decree, which is our document 2875 PS and cited in 1938, Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 1580. The third decree, entitled Decree for the Restoration of the Appearance of the Streets by Jewish Economic Enterprises, took care of the insurance question raised in the morning's meeting by providing that insurance due to the Jews for various losses sustained by them was to be collected by the state. I ask the court to notice judicially that decree also. It is our document 2694 PS and appears in 1938 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 1581.
Shall we break off for 10 minutes, sir?
May it please the tribunal, the material I alluded to before the recess, we feel is merely illustrative of the energetic manner in which the defendant Goering took part in driving the Jews from the economic life at this period. Two other documents would seem to be pertinent on this point. And I would like to offer our document 069 PS as USA Exhibit 589, which is a circular letter dated the 17th of January 1939, signed by the defendant Bormann, distributing a directive of the defendant Goering with respect to certain discriminations to be observed in the housing of Jews. I'm content with that summarization, if Your Honor please, and I do not intend to read further from that document. The second document I desire to offer is our document 1208 PS, which I offer as USA Exhibit 590. That is in order of the defendant Goering as Commissioner for the 4-year plan, dated the 10th of December 1938, prescribing the manner in which exploitation of Jewish property is to be undertaken, and warning that any profit resulting from the elimination of Jews from economic activity is to go to the Reich. There is no need, I believe, to read excerpts from the document, except that I do wish to call the attention of the tribunal to the fact that Goering's letter is addressed to all the chief agencies of the Reich, to all political leaders and leaders of the affiliated organizations of the party, to all Gauleiter, to all Reichsstatthalter or governors, and to the various local heads of the German lands and subdivisions thereof. As the German armies moved into other countries, the anti-Jewish laws were extended, often in a more stringent form, to the occupied territories. Many of the decrees were not signed by the defendant Goering himself, but were issued on the basis of decrees signed by him. Nevertheless, in his capacity as Commissioner for the 4-year plan, or as Chairman of the Ministerial Council for National Defense, the defendant Goering himself signed a number of anti-Jewish decrees for occupied territory, including the decrees enumerated on pages 47 and 48 of our brief, of which I will ask the tribunal to take judicial notice. During the later years of the war, the program of the Nazi conspirators for the complete physical annihilation of all Jews in Europe achieved its full fury. While the execution of this anti-Jewish program was for the most part handled by the SS and the security police, the defendant Goering remains implicated to the last in the final efforts to achieve a Nazi solution of the Jewish problem. On the 31st of July, 1941, he wrote a letter to the conspirator Heydrich, which is the final document to which I wish to draw the tribunal's attention. It is a fitting climax to our presentation on this defendant. The reason why it was addressed to the notorious Heydrich, the predecessor of the defendant Kaltenbrunner, need not strain our imagination. This document is our document 710 PS, which has already been admitted as USA Exhibit 509 in connection with the case on the Gestapo. And while it has already been read into evidence, with the permission of the court, I would like to close my presentation with a reading of that letter. Goering writes to Heydrich, complimenting the task that was assigned to you on the 24th of January 1939, which dealt with arriving at a thorough furtherance of emigration and evacuation, a solution of the Jewish problem, as advantageously as possible, I hereby charge you with making all necessary preparations in regard to organizational and financial matters for bringing about a complete solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. Wherever other governmental agencies are involved, these are to cooperate with you. I charge you furthermore to send me, before long, an overall plan concerning the organizational, factual, and material measures necessary for the accomplishment of the desired solution of the Jewish question. The presentation made to the tribunal on the individual responsibility of the defendant Goering has been intended to be merely illustrative of the mass of documentary evidence which reveals the leading part played by this conspirator in every phase of the Nazi conspiracy. Thus, we submit that the responsibility of Goering for the crimes with which he has been charged under count 1 and count 2 of the indictment has been established.